In this video, we're going to be testing and playing with every single katana with an optimized build to try get the maximum amount of damage out of each one to see which is the most overpowered katana in Elden Ring. So let's begin with the early game favorite, the Moonveil. As you can see, this is a set that I've put on here. The helmet actually does increase our intelligence with this build, but at the expense of some FP and some stamina. So this is the Moonveil, and this is how you can use it to easily destroy your enemies. It's one of the more stronger mage weapons. On its own, it's great, but if you pair this with the staff, it can be even greater. It's usually going to be a good crutch early game to defeat anything that is going to be tough to beat. Against bigger enemies like giants like this, you can see you can struggle a bit because you don't deal a lot of damage, and you have to kind of rely on the Ash of War for the most part, especially if you're built into intelligence, though you can kind of get close enough to do stagger, but you have to be really close for that to take effect. But for most of the time, you're just going to be throwing off these slashes there, chipping away at the enemy's health. The greatest thing about the weapon is that you can get some distance while doing the slashes, so it's the only one where you really get to use a katana from a great distance and still be able to deal a decent amount of damage without getting too close to your enemies, which of course allows you to be more safer so that you don't actually get hit often. But you can see sometimes your strengths with the magic will actually come in handy against certain enemies or bosses, like this guy over here, the giants, who are very weak to magic type enemies or magic type damage, as well as like hectic, stronger physical things like from the Meteoric blade that we'll be using shortly. At the end of every showcase, I will show you what stats I'm using for each build here, as well as everything I have equipped. As you can see here, it's the Moonveil, the helmet here that increases our intelligence, and then the armor in case you're interested in the armor I'm wearing. None of them really have benefits besides the helmets. It's more for the aesthetic look. And these are the talismans that I have here, increasing my power to as much as I can get it to increase. If you have any suggestions or comments, leave them down in the comments below. I do reply to every single one, so you're free to touch on any of these topics. The next weapon of choice is Rivers of Blood, the late game favorite. Once people get this, they usually use it for the rest of their lives until they've beaten the game at least once or twice. I, in fact, am victim to this because I did just that. So the Rivers of Blood is one of the easiest weapons to trade damage with most of the enemies in the game that take blood loss, because you can just zerg them down. Because it's blood loss damage, it deals percentage-based damage on the enemies, so it doesn't matter like how weak or strong you are. As long as you have blood loss on the weapon and you are getting enough strikes in, the enemy will take sheer amounts of damage. Because of this, the bigger the health pool the enemy has, the easier they will be. So weaker enemies, generally every weapon will be like, fair with, but if the enemy has insane amounts of health, you're going to destroy them with Rivers of Blood, because you're going to destroy everything at the same speed, because it's all percentage-based damage. However, for enemies that do not take blood loss damage, like for example the last boss or several bosses throughout the game, or like this thing over here, it's going to be a bit more of a challenge to try, get them down, because you can't just, hope for those like giant procs of damage to go off. You have to fight them the hard way. So this is the build for Rivers of Blood. Obviously, we put a shitload of points into Arcane, and these are all the items I have equipped to make this stronger. The helmet is the only thing increasing our blood loss damage when blood loss is around us. The rest of the armor is purely aesthetical to make the character kind of look cool, just to look like I'm a Rivers of Blood user kind of vibe. And then these are the talismans that we have equipped here to get the most damage out of this, as well as the Wondrous Physic. The next weapon is not the easiest katana to get, it's probably the hardest katana to get in the game, and this is the Hand of Malenia. As you can see, this beautiful long-ass sword is capable of sheer destruction, but only when you use it in certain situations and you use it right. Obviously, it has a slow-timed Ash of War, and when you press the Ash of War button multiple times, it will do the whole succession of attacks, the Waterfell Dance, that Malenia does herself. As you can see there, it has devastatingly hectic physical damage, and when you pair this up with certain talismans, it makes it really great to use. However, you are very interruptible, and it can stop you the moment an enemy hits you or lightly staggers you and ruins your whole thing there. I got very lucky with this giant there and made it look way better than I think it actually is, but you'll see in some cases it's actually quite difficult to get this to go off, because every time you get hit, the whole thing stops. It just stops. So it's a difficult weapon to use, and it's very situational, but if you use it right, or maybe even in PvP and you get off a nice kind of slew of attacks, you can probably kill your enemies very easy. It also works great for AoE, hitting anything that's in the area of where you're attacking. As you can see here against these guys, it actually works quite well as well. As you can see here, we go here through all those swipes because there's so many different sweeping hits that we got going on here, and then you just pair this with a nice heavy attack and boom, enemy's gone. Of course, we do have the normal light and heavy attacks for these weapons, as well as jumping and crouching attacks. This is the build that I'm using for this, obviously with a boatload of dexterity, because we're just trying to increase the amount of damage we can get out of this weapon, because it scales heavily off of dexterity. For the armor, there's nothing that benefits the kind of set or the build entirely at all. It's just purely aesthetical to make it look cool, and these are the talismans to make our damage do as much damage as we can possibly get out of it. If you have any suggestions, feel free to let them down in the comments down below. For our next build, it's the Meteoric Blade with an offhand Uchigatana with a heavy affinitied Hoarfrost Stomp. It doesn't really matter what like Ash of War we have there. It's just to get it with an A rating on the strength. So this is a pure strength-based build designed on staggering your enemies and dealing straight up physical damage. Now the Meteoric Blade has an insane amount of stagger when you use its heavy ability, and when you charge that heavy strike, it will bring most enemies down to their knees or into a position where you can critically hit them. So it works fantastically. Not so great against these giants here because they kind of stomp around. Obviously, you need to have some time to charge your heavy attack as well as be able to be close enough to actually get the attack off in general. But once you do get the stun or the stagger on there, we do have the Uchigatana in our offhand so that we're able to deal insane amounts of damage. As you can see here, these two giants lying in the same spot here. We're just going to do the double attacks here, and obviously since they both have blood loss, it's going to work in our favor quite immensely. It also counts as an extreme heavy weapon, so you see when we use it up against these kind of like rock giants, we're able to deal mad amounts of damage, and that's just with the heavy charge attack. And obviously you can swap over to your dual swinging attacks to do crazy damage. This is something you can get early in the game as well. Meteoric Blade is very accessible early game, and Uchigatana you get from playing as a samurai or also in Limgrave. So this is the build with all the stats in particular. You can see here it's mostly strength orientated so that we can do insane amounts of physical damage. The armor doesn't benefit the build at all. It's just purely aesthetical in this case to make it look cool. And if you have any suggestions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below on how you could make this better, or if you use a build similar to this and what you're using differently from what I used in this video. The final katana that we're testing today is the final special one that we have access to. This is the Dragonscale Blade. We've also paired this up with an Uchigatana. This Uchigatana has a cold affinity Hoarfrost Stomp so that we can benefit from, well, cold kind of like frost buildup. This weapon has an Ash of War called Ice Lightning Sword, and as you can see, it coats my sword, the Dragonscale Blade, in lightning, and I'm guessing it does some ice as well, though I don't really experience that too much. But in any case, I have paired up cold or frost buildup on the Uchigatana so that when we do dual attacks, we can proc our enemies with frost just like that and deal insane amounts of damage afterwards. Of all the special katanas in the game, I still think this is probably one of the weakest ones, and it doesn't really compare to the damage output that the other swords can do, especially with how hard it is or how late game you actually get the Dragonscale Blade. It doesn't hardly feel worth it, though I might be using it wrong in this build. You can let me know in the comments below if that is the case. However, it's not a favorite of mine. I don't particularly enjoy it. I find myself struggling with this one the most out of all, as you can see here. I mean, most of this is probably my fault for just not dodging at the right time, but still the damage output makes me fight these enemies way longer than I feel like I need to, whereas a lot of the other katanas let me kill the enemies way before, you know, the fight goes on this long and gets dragged through all these different phases. And for its final boss, or the final giant type here, this is how it compares against this. It actually does a surprising amount of damage against these as well, which was, you know, unfortunate that I got hit there, but it still does a decent amount of damage on these big guys. So for that, I guess it might be a successful weapon to use. This is the build that I used for the Dragonscale Blade with all the stats over here, mostly into Dexterity, which is the main stat of the Dragonscale Blade, as you can see here. So we have this paired up with the Uchigatana, as you know, and then the armor pieces are just aesthetic. There's no special bonuses across any of them, so it's just to create a nice look. You can use whatever armor you want. These are the talismans that I'm using. If you recommend using something different or a different change to this build in particular, because this is probably my weakest build I've used here. Overall, I still think that Rivers of Blood is hands down the most overpowered weapon because it's just unstoppable. It's just too good to be compared to all the other weapons because it focuses on percentage-based damage. So the more health an enemy has, the easier you can defeat it, whereas all the other weapons, you're dealing a set amount of damage the entire time. Now that doesn't mean any of the katanas are specifically bad. In fact, most of them are incredibly strong in the game, and the game tends to favor katanas over most of the other weapons. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and let me know which is your favorite katana in the game, and thank you so much for watching.